work on everything from crop inputs through retail, as you just heard. And one of the things that's gotten more challenging over time is coming into a room perhaps where you don't know everyone or they don't know you, and talking about, the most controversial thing you're going to talk about, politics, the things you don't talk about at the dinner table. And so just ask for a little bit of grace around maybe the language. I'm not intending to be provocative, but it's getting, I think, harder and harder to talk about politics without offending people. And so just wanted to ask for a little bit of grace as we talk about the current affairs and everything that's happening here, because we care deeply about the issues that you all care about, and we think about them every day. If you are interested, we do have a newsletter that we put out every week that Congress is in session, so a little plug for that if you're interested in keeping in touch with us. When I think about how to think about 2026 and what's coming our way, and maybe this is just because in undergrad I studied history, but I think it's really important to understand what we learned from 2025, what we saw, what were the dynamics. And I think obviously there was a lot of change in 2025, and so I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about 2025, the big issues, and some interesting, to me at least, changes in procedure and process, and then talk a little bit about what we expect in 2026, so the crystal ball of it all, and then how we're thinking about how to approach the landscape, what's changed, how to maneuver differently, but also what are those core principles of, if you care about something in agriculture and you want DC to know about it, how to talk about that, how to engage on that. And so that's kind of the framework for today. But just really looking at 2025, new administration, new priorities, new cadence. The new administration, of course, was sworn in almost a year ago this month. And they came in very fast with a lot of different priorities, and moved at a speed that I think really livened up our work, certainly. They focused on some key priorities here. I know that there are ones missing from this list, but it's already a pretty lengthy list there, so notably animal disease isn't on this list, but it was certainly something that they had to spend a lot of time focusing on. But one of the things that we saw out of the gate, and maybe some of you felt the impacts of this, were the USDA funding freezes. So the president put out some executive orders that the agencies responded to, and so a lot of USDA's funding was frozen. And then also the focus on staff reduction, so we'll talk about that a little bit. USDA reorganization, so following up from the first administration and some shifts that they had done to ERS and NIFA, two of the agencies at USDA. Of course, tariffs, trade deals, big focus for the administration, immigration and ag labor, MAHA, and Farmers First and Buy American. So we'll talk a little bit around these new priorities and give you a sense of where things have left off so that we can think about that heading into 2026. So of course, out of the gate, the funding freezes. Some funding was frozen temporarily, and while they underwent a review to make sure that the funding was in compliance with the administration's priorities, particularly from the White House. So things around diversity, equity, inclusion, scrubbing all of the requests for applications around that language. Things like the regional food business centers, which were created coming out of COVID, were canceled outright. Things like the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, that program, significant program from the last administration, has been changed. So we'll likely see some attrition of that funding, but also reprogramming to make sure that it was really with this Farmers First focus. And then other programs were shifted slightly this year, and we'll sort of see what the fate of those is moving forward. So the program that doubles incentives at farmers markets, for example, and other groceries, the GusNIP program, that program, they had a really different application process right at the end of the fiscal year to try to get that out the door. So this was a lot of the effort and energy, I think, in the first quarter of this year, and as the year progressed, we saw, I guess last year, still getting used to being in 2026, but this was a lot of the focus around how is the government effectuating its resources and how will it proceed? And so we'll see a carryover of I think, some of this energy around a real discernment of whether the funding that's going out the door is in alignment with the administration. We saw, you all remember, a guy named Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. This was another big focus coming out of the gate. So really modifying what the staffing looks like. Really significant reduction at USDA. OIG, the Inspector General, released a report last month that said about 20,000 employees left the department, and 3/4 of that was due to the deferred resignation program. So the fork in the road that Elon Musk had presented in his role at the Department of Government Efficiency. This is something that has meaningful impacts. We have clients that are trying to understand when they're going to get a determination from the department, and those things are slower with fewer people. Your relationships can walk out the door with the deferred resignation program. So it does have impacts in terms of how you engage with the department, that they're doing more with less, and that can be a challenge, but that's another big priority that we saw. And I don't know if we're necessarily done with this process either. USDA has typically a little bit of an older staff anyhow, and we had already started to see quite a few retirements heading into last year, and then certainly expedited with this fork in the road memo. The USDA reorganization was proposed. I had mentioned that in the first Trump administration, they had relocated the Economic Research Service and the Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, to Kansas City. And this is kind of a much more drastic version of that reorganization. So really trying to move a lot of the people out of DC and into 5 area hubs. You can see on the slide there. Closing South Building, consolidating support functions. So if you have human resources in one agency, that carries, you just have one human resources instead of having them all in each of the different agencies. There was a comment period opened this fall, and there were 14,000 unique comments that the agency has considered. They put out a report on this last month, and by and large, the feedback was pretty negative about doing this, and folks were concerned about loss of additional staff. So I mentioned we might not be done with losing staff at USDA, but loss of additional staff, loss of expertise, access. So if you think about coming to DC, how many of you have been to DC and kind of a fly-in, met with your legislators in DC? Good to meet you. So if you also went down to the agency, or down to USDA or EPA, that may be less of an opportunity if they're located in these hubs, and you might have to catch them when you're skiing in Salt Lake City. I mentioned tariffs and trade agreements. This is a chaotic slide, and it is very much intended to be a chaotic slide. You're not meant to read this or understand this. But when I think about everything that's happened in trade over the last couple or several months, if we were to carry this slide over, I think into this year, I think we would largely see a continuation of all of these different actions. And if you think about how the president likes to operate, he really likes to be in this position of always negotiating. So we saw this kind of carry out throughout the year. And it can be hard to keep track of everything that's happening here. Some big bolded items here with Liberation Day, when we applied tariffs across the board, and the reciprocal tariffs that we have seen carry out over this year. I don't think we'll see necessarily a big change in terms of the cadence of everything happening in the conversation in trade, but I do think organizing it, and this will get to my point about how to engage right now, but I think organizing it in a way that's clear or chaotic is helpful, and understanding that the dynamic has really changed. So previously you would expect a trade agreement is announced, we would announce that they're having meetings, we would announce that we're engaging with our friends in Canada, and then we would wait to announce those details until everything was signed, sealed, and delivered. You guys might be aware. We often learn about these trade deals on Truth Social from the president himself, and then we get the details thereafter. And so there's a little bit of patience that comes with understanding this, and a real need to understand what the details are and how they impact your Apple business or your cherries or what have you. And so this is just a slide or two to help how we think about trade and tariffs in this environment. This, to me, I think, is one of the ones that makes it the most clear about everything that's going on and some pending actions right now. So we have the WTO compliant trade tariffs, so trade remedies, so there's dumping happening, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties. Most favored nation is the one on the left there. These are sort of your ordinary tariffs outside of trade agreements. The big ones here that I want to point to, and I am somewhat fortunate that the Supreme Court hasn't ruled today, so I didn't need to digest that overnight and share with you what the Supreme Court ruled, but we're all waiting to see how the Supreme Court is going to treat the IEEPA tariffs as they're known. And these are the two on the far right there. So the tariffs on nearly every country that came out of Liberation Day, and then of course the ones around fentanyl concerns and immigration. And so those two, there's two different cases at the Supreme Court, and there's some expectation that tomorrow we will understand how the Supreme Court views these tariffs. There are other tools in the toolbox, so if the Supreme Court, there's a couple different options that they rule against the tariffs completely. We know that the president and the administration have been thinking about other ways to tariff, so they may use other tools in the toolbox. They could also say that the tariffs are fine or somewhere in between, or rule differently on either case. So we're anxiously awaiting the impact of the Supreme Court on that. Again, maybe tomorrow we'll know more about how they rule on that. But certainly the tariff and trade dynamic is one that has been very, very busy this year, and keeping track of that is one of the tasks that we've had underhand. Another big one, especially for places like New York, is the USMCA, so our agreement with Mexico and Canada. This is a really new process. This is a new timeline. These are new to this new USMCA, so we didn't do this under NAFTA. But the process, as it unfolds, the U.S. wanted a review process, and so that's the process we're in right now. By July, there has to be a determination by all three countries of whether or not they want to stay in USMCA, and that will re-up a 16-year agreement. If not, there's a long runway for us to exit USMCA, or if any of the countries don't agree to continue forward with USMCA as it is, we then start a 1-year annual review process. So there was a stakeholder meeting that USTR hosted in the late fall, and then they published a report to Congress in December, and so we're sort of in this middle of this process that will culminate with a decision in July. This is something that we have seen agriculture, at least in this current process, maybe not be as acknowledged as it had been in the first USMCA review or agreement conversations. We're seeing a tremendous focus on autos, and so I think this is a real opportunity for engagement around trade as well. Of course, the first quarter of this year and up through this week, a lot around immigration enforcement, and similarly, a huge conversation in DC around the need for a stable workforce and on ag labor and some of the challenges that agriculture has with labor. We of course saw the crackdown at the border, and also a lot of we were hearing from clients about challenges with folks being stuck at the border that were trying to come over and work. So a really significant shift in terms of what happened with border and the border security. We also saw some changes on the regulatory front. So the adverse effect wage rate, we saw a suspension of the survey that they used to conduct those wage rates. There was some litigation, so the Department of Labor rescinded that rule, which set the rates for farmer pay, or for labor pay, and then they issued an interim final rule. And so we're likely to see more to come in terms of the regulatory space on what the Department of Labor is going to do. We expect there's been some lawsuits filed already. This wage rate piece is something that's subject to a lot of litigation. And so we'll talk a little bit more around kind of the outlook for ag labor as well. Make America Healthy, again, has been a really new issue this time in the Trump administration. This was all the way through an executive order. A couple of reports were released this summer. And USDA and HHS, in a way that we haven't really seen before, are in lockstep. They seem to be good friends. They were sworn in on the same day of the two secretaries for the departments. And we've really seen them focus in on food in a way that I think is unprecedented, and may that be the only time I say unprecedented today, because I know we talk about that a lot. SNAP waivers, so restricting what people can buy with SNAP benefits, has been one of the wins that they've touted for MAHA. Dietary guidelines came out yesterday, and so changing the dietary guidelines, particularly how they treat the protein industry, was a big focus of this week, and so these are another one of the areas that they focused on. Regenerative agriculture is something that the department is talking about a lot, and announcing new initiatives to help with regenerative agriculture and help stimulate sustainable regenerative practices. And then the one area of kind of controversy within MAHA tends to be around pesticide policy. And so that's an area that we watch really closely for any kind of fissures in terms of the administration around Make America Healthy Again, and how it looks at agriculture and how it treats agriculture. So those are kind of the big issues that we saw this year. And again, that's not the whole list. But interestingly, we're seeing kind of a new, and I said a new old way of business because it's not a new way. It's been around for almost 100 years, but we're seeing the deployment of discharge petitions. You've probably heard about big headline discharge petitions, but we're seeing these more and more. There's the House is voting on one this week, and the discharge petition is basically a way for you to circumvent leadership. So leadership in the House has a lot of control about what the body votes on and what they consider. Some of that is through their own determination, but also through the very powerful Rules Committee that sets up the rules of debate on a bill. We are seeing the deployment of this process, which allows the minority, if they can grab a couple in the majority, so if you only need 218 signatures on a petition, to force the body to consider a bill. So we're seeing this on healthcare this week. We've seen it on other issues as well, but this isn't a new tool that we are seeing deployed at a rate that we haven't seen before. In the last 40 years, it's been used successfully twice, and we've seen it, I think, 7 times this year already. So it is a really new way of conducting business, and I think one of the reasons that we're seeing this is that we're seeing a real, if you measure congressional efficacy by how many laws they pass, and I think you could debate whether or not that's the best tool to measure, we're seeing very few laws get enacted. We've seen laws on renaming post offices fail, which is, thank you for that also, was amusing to us. There are some real challenges in terms of getting things across the finish line. We'll talk a little bit about some of the successes that this Congress has had in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but we're seeing much larger packages, and we're seeing there's a lot of committee activity and there's a lot of bills being introduced, but in terms of what's actually getting signed into law, we're seeing a lot less of this. And so we are we're in 2026 already, and we are entering into a year where we have midterms coming up, of course, and that really changes the dynamic in DC when you're in an election year, and we're already starting to feel the consequences of being in an election year. The issues moving forward in 2026, I think we'll see many of the same issues move forward. I mentioned we'll still see a lot happening on trade and tariffs. MAHA, I don't see any signs of that shifting as a priority. I think there's a lot of press releases and wins that come out of MAHA. It's polls very popularly, particularly among Republicans. Also, I think from you can't get a much better bumper sticker issue to make America healthy again. Labor, I think now that there's a positioning around, now that the border is secure, can we use this opportunity to actually get some reforms to the H-2A program to get a more stable workforce that farmers can afford, that can be consistent, that there's some certainty around that. And we know that the chairman of the Agriculture Committee is looking at an ag labor bill. He's been working on it for several months, following up to a working group he had pulled together last year. And that we will likely see a markup of that in the House Agriculture Committee maybe this month. He says this month. I would maybe give him a bit more time into February. That is likely to focus on things around seasonality, around codifying some changes on the adverse effect wage rate. And that's something that I think now that there's a little bit more of an opportunity to talk about the ag labor needs, and we're hearing more of that come up in DC. The Farm Bill, so I mentioned that Congress is having, is signing, getting fewer bills signed into law. I think we're all feeling the impacts of that with the Farm Bill, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then the disaster assistance conversation is really picking up, and I think we'll see a lot of energy around that in 26. We saw that in the fall, a lot of conversation around the need for some disaster assistance, whether that's due to the trade dynamics or environmental disasters. We've seen USDA basically do what they can in terms of their flexibilities with the CCC to put out some disaster payments. Some farmers will start to see those checks later this month or into next month. And then we have seen a real drive for the need for additional help on the specialty crop side. So just this morning, the chairman was quoted of the Ag Committee on the House side was quoted as talking about we really need to figure out a disaster package for specialty crops, because what has been put out there so far is not going to be sufficient to address the needs. I do think that will be a really major driving issue this year. The process component of this, I like to divide this into kind of 4 quadrants about how we think about what's happening in DC and what drives that. I think we'll continue to see discharge petitions. If you think about it and you're in a competitive seat and you're trying to prove your value as a member, you want to have things that you can point to. And if Congress is not passing a lot of laws, I think that's an opportunity to really differentiate yourself and to run on those. So I think we'll continue to see that. We'll also continue to see careful negotiations. So we are now at a House that stands at 218 versus 213. And that will mean that you need consensus, and that can be really hard to drive towards as we see. So careful negotiations. When we think about the One Big Beautiful Bill, it took almost 5.5 months to get that across the finish line, which is a lot of time in terms of Congress and how they maneuver, and it really kind of took all the air out of the room in terms of working on other things like the Farm Bill. So we'll continue to see negotiations be really carefully crafted. Trump's influence is, of course, one that is really an important part of understanding the process. So when does he weigh in? When does he share his opinion? When does he not? And that's another kind of key area that we see. We've seen him engage less than he did in the first administration, and I think that has consequences in terms of how long it takes for Congress to get to a consensus position. We've also seen the administration leverage priorities in new ways. And I would note for New York specifically, New York is one of the states that the administration really has their eyes on. They mentioned this, I don't know if any of you caught, the White House had a press briefing yesterday and they talked about dietary guidelines, so I tuned in, and one of the things that they talked about was really making sure that they're doing a thorough review in states like Minnesota, New York, and California. And so that's one where we've seen the administration leveraging their priorities in new ways. And what I mean by that is there was $50 billion in rural health money that went out the door, or has been approved as of like December 30th or something. And that money, every state applied for. And in the application, it was made very clear that the administration wanted states to restrict SNAP and what you could purchase with SNAP. And so we saw that be a part of the criteria for states in their application process. 2 different agencies, 2 different issue areas, but that's one of the ways that we've seen the administration kind of leverage what they want to happen in different ways. And that's just one example of many. But I think that that's something we've seen SNAP, for example, on data collection, that be one where the administration has really tried to leverage the work that they do with states and trying to get states to partner with them, and then if not, trying to find ways to make sure it's known that there are consequences for that. Reconciliation 2.0, I think we'll see some proposals around that in the very near future, around another big package of reconciliation. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a moment. The people, so we are already starting to see congressional retirements. We expect several more congressional retirements to come up, notably Elise Stefanik from New York, of course, but several other members as well, including on the Agriculture Committee. We are also seeing people jumping ship for other roles, and so this may very much impact the Agriculture Committee. There's, scuttlebutt this week that with Governor Walz retiring, that the ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Senator Klobuchar, may run for governor in the state. And so we will continue to see congressional retirements and a real shakeup, and every time someone retires, because it's been so long since we've done a farm bill, we lose people that have been there for what those negotiations have looked like in the past and have that expertise. We'll also see staff turnover. If you remember the first Trump administration, we were measuring time in Scaramucci's and how long the press secretary had lasted. It's been a really different situation this time around. We have not seen the turnover at the agency level or cabinet level or even at the staff level yet. But I will say we're in January, so we're about a year in. These jobs, particularly at the staff level, are grueling. They're working round the clock. And so we do expect some turnover on that level too. And when you have people walking out the door, of course you have to replace them. You lose some of that expertise, that institutional knowledge, and so it can slow things down. And so that impacts, I think, in my mind, the timing, and that access to staff and all of those things. So those are kind of the people component of what we're thinking about in 2026 and we're likely to see. And then the cadence. And this one I think is really interesting because I think it cuts in a couple of different ways. So you have an urgency before the midterms. You really want to demonstrate your value. You want to win your election. You want to have a lot to show for it. And so there's a big push for that. We also know that congressional activity really drops off after the 4th of July. So members go home, they're home for all of August, they're home for all of October, they have to get a funding bill done for the government somewhere in between there. So the activity really slows down. So there's this really big push in the front part of the year. And then we've seen a lot of urgency, I think, from this Congress to begin with, but the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. So things around what happened in reconciliation, around SNAP, around taxes, around border security, those big priorities coming in have been addressed. And so now we're left with much more simple and uncomplicated and uncontroversial things like healthcare. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is to see how fast things can be accomplished in a really challenging environment where you don't have huge margins. And what are the priorities and the consensus priorities. And so, we talk about this as kind of the key part of how we think about it. I kind of gave up the prediction business a long time ago, but what we do predict is change, and the data just is there. So every 2 years since 2006, we've seen some iteration of change. And so this is, you only have a 2-year period with uniform control. You really have a lot of sense of trying to get it done as quickly as possible. So it's a really critical year in terms of the administration's priorities. And we expect change, and that's not to say that I have predictions about what's going to happen in November, but change has been the constant, and I think that that's something that everyone in DC is keeping in mind as they navigate their priorities and navigate the way that they're maneuvering in Congress or in the administration, is that you may only have a limited amount of time to work on your priorities. Speaking of priorities for agriculture, the Farm Bill has been one of those bills that we have been talking about for several years now. All of my very well organized files on the Farm Bill are named the 2023 Farm Bill, and 1 year I will update those. What we've seen, 2018 of course is the last Farm Bill that was enacted, and in 2023 we got our first 1-year extension. Okay, that's kind of ordinary. It takes Congress some time. It's a pretty big piece of text, a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different issues, and weren't able to get it across the finish line in 23. Okay, so 24 comes, we got another 1-year extension. And then the One Big Beautiful Bill passed, and there was about $63 billion in there for agriculture, some $200 billion cuts in SNAP. So some Farm Bill policies and procedures in there, but not all of them. And definitely not a suspension of permanent law, which is like the big hammer that you need to get something done in Congress, which is that it would revert to 1930s and 40s farm policy. So we did another 1-year extension when the Ag FDA appropriations bill was passed. And so we're currently sitting in that 1-year extension right now. It goes through the end of September, but the actual deadline is the end of this calendar year for yet another activity to happen, whether that's an extension or a full reauthorization. So we talk about all the challenges, the numbers, the math, the midterms, the cadence, all of that. This is one of the big issues that we think about, is how does it fit into those dynamics. So we are currently in the extension right now, and I want to talk a little bit around reconciliation, because I mentioned we'll likely see another version of that come out, and just take a little bit of a step back and talk about what reconciliation is, because it's not the single tool where everything you want to happen like a Farm Bill can fit into that. It is related to spending and taxes. That is its main purpose. And it requires only a majority vote, which is the really important part, is it's easier to get it across the finish line if you have all three chambers. The Inflation Reduction Act was an example of this, the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We've also saw One Big Beautiful Bill over the summer, and that was, when I mentioned congressional efficacy, One Big Beautiful Bill was enormous. It covered a lot of different issue areas, but it was also somewhat limited, because with reconciliation, it has to do with cutting money or spending money. You cannot create new policy. So if you wanted to change, our dairy policy, for example, you couldn't do that in reconciliation. And that's really, we can kind of blame the Senate for that, but they have a lot of rules around what is in or out. And it has to fit both of these criteria, so not cutting or spending money, and no creation of new policy in order to be eligible for reconciliation. So we did a lot on ag policy. We got doubled the money for our ag promotion programs, for example, in the bill. But we need a farm bill, because if you think about, and this is a pretty overly simplistic way of talking about farm bill in the reconciliation context, but 41 pages of text in the bill over the summer compared to the 500 in 2019 from the 2018 Farm Bill. there were a lot of provisions, a lot of changes that I'm sure you all would like to see, that others have advocated for, that just couldn't go into a reconciliation bill because of the restrictions on those two parameters that I mentioned. So there's a lot still on the cutting room floor around a farm bill and the need to reauthorize that. So this is one of the kind of the big issues that we're thinking a lot about right now, and there are some really challenging dynamics heading into this year in order to get a farm bill done in 2026. I think that we've seen a really big increase in the partisanship in the committee. There's a lot of Democrats are pretty upset still around the cuts to SNAP that happened in One Big Beautiful Bill. And their priority heading into a farm bill is, okay, we need to restore some of those cuts. We need to give states at least more time in order to be able to start cost sharing the benefits or to get their improper payment rates down. And I won't dig into that too much, but happy to answer any questions on that in a moment. And Republicans are looking at, okay, we need more disaster money. We have changes we may like to see on conservation, on Title I programs, the reference prices maybe that they updated over the summer or maybe outdated already. So we have really two big different priorities heading into this negotiation. And it ultimately is something that we maintain has to be a bipartisan bill. And so if you're having challenges around communication on that still, I think that creates a really hard environment to try to get a farm bill done in 2026. Just skip over this one, but I think there's a few drivers that I think could really change that dynamic. One is around all of the conversation that's happening around disaster and the need for additional resources on disaster assistance. We continue to see agriculture calling for additional support. And the administration, I think, is pretty much tapped out in terms of their legal authority and their financial ability within the Commodity Credit Corporation to release any more money on disaster besides what they've already announced. But we are continuing to see the call for Congress to act on this, and I think that if you're talking about a bipartisan fix, you will of course expect that Democrats will want to have some changes on the SNAP side as well. And a couple of kind of driving forces in the SNAP space, we saw just recently the latest food insecurity report come out of USDA, which is their last food insecurity report that they'll be doing. This measures whether or not people have enough access to food, whether they're cutting out food in their daily lives. It's a series of questions. And we saw food insecurity trend down in 2023, and so I think that's one of the driving forces is we're seeing more calls for food assistance, but also in the context that One Big Beautiful Bill took a mighty chunk out of SNAP, and we don't fully understand the consequences of that yet. So a lot of the burden was shifted to the states or will be shifted in FY28. And so we don't know quite yet what the consequences of that will be in terms of on state budgets, whether or not states are able to make up that money and whether or not this dynamic could worsen. And so this has been, I think, one of the conversations that's really happening right now. We are all talking about inflation and food prices and all of that, and I think that's very much feeding into the conversation around food security as well. And then of course this is kind of the latest projection around farm income. I think this conversation around the 3-year drop in farm income is definitely also driving conversation in DC. And so whether or not we're able to overcome these two hurdles, ordinarily you have priorities around nutrition and agriculture. There's that harmony that happens with the Farm Bill, but I think it's ultimately whether or not these are enough of a driving force to get it across that final hurdle. And then ag labor, just to kind of follow up on the issues that I outlined in the beginning, I do see this as an area where there will be a lot of work done this year. There are 5 pretty major bills that have already been introduced. We're expecting, as I mentioned, the one from Chairman Thompson soon, this month, next month maybe. We saw last Congress a bipartisan ag labor working group, so if you're interested in what they're proposing, this is kind of where you'd find the bulk of that. This was a bipartisan process. They're really going to carry out this work in the